Welcome everyone to ArtTable's program, ArtNet, Artist Breakfast. And I want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, who's ArtNet, and in a few moments we'll be hearing from Heidi Lee And it's cold out there, so we're especially grateful that you've come and weathered the weather. So before we get started, and on behalf of ArtTable once again, I would like to thank ArtNet for sponsoring this particular program. I also want to introduce my fellow committee members, whom I see Heather is here, but I don't know that Sarah or Gracie are here today, but we're all very hard working as a group, and we all play different roles to make this happen. So the committee members are Sarah Marquette, Heather Darcy Vendari, who's here with us today, and was the point person on the Eleanor Antin communications and really made this one happen. And myself, Joy Glidden, and ArtNet's Gracie Manchin. So that's our committee, and we're going to take a brief moment to hear from Heidi, who, and I see there's lots of goodies on the table. So why don't you come up and we'll do a few of the regular ArtTable introductions in just one moment.
ArtNet is constantly expanding and improving its database and online resources. We now have 2 million visitors a month, and we offer 8 million auction results on our database from over 1,400 auction houses worldwide. So I hope you all have had a chance to take advantage of our resources online. If not, please feel free to grab me afterwards, and I'm more than happy to talk about what we have to offer to benefit your businesses. And we also do partnerships. So if anyone is interested in doing a partnership with ArtNet, please also contact me for that. I handle the strategic partnerships here as well. So without further ado, for your feature artist presentation, I'll pass it on to Joy.
Okay.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so a couple of things. I'd like to ask everyone to turn off their cell phones. This is one of those minor things that sometimes can be rather annoying. Also, keep just a quick reminder that this event is being recorded for documentation purposes, so that you are aware and agree to be included in this process. We submit that you waive your rights of usage. If anyone has a problem with this, please contact me or Lucy, and we'll make sure that you are taken out of the process. But it's kind of fun and exciting, and it's pretty much in-house, so it goes up on various websites, ArtNet as well as ArtTable, and many of our colleagues get to actually see who aren't here during the breakfast. We are honored to have you here today, Eleanor, and I'm happy that you've invited Emily Liebert to be in conversation with. Heather is going to formally do an introduction, and I'll pass it over to Heather.
This could be 10 minutes long. I'll try to keep it short because Eleanor has such an amazing career. So we are obviously thrilled to have Eleanor and Emily here today. For decades, Eleanor has maintained a studio practice using diverse media, including performance, film, installation, drawing, writing, and photography. Is there anything she can't do? To explore the nuances of gender, race, and identity. Since the early 70s, Eleanor has developed multiple selves or personae, whose experiences and identities have been drawn from historical events to explore contemporary realities. In this age of avatars and virtual identities, Eleanor's multiple selves take on new significance. When watching her Art 21 videos, I was thrilled to see that they were classified as humorous. I don't know how you feel about that. Yeah. Even in the most tough, thought-provoking, or critical work, there's always a certain levity that makes the image of performance all the more poignant. Always fascinated by Greek mythology, Eleanor has created a world of make-believe,
heavily rooted in history where she is an actor and a creator. She's a self-proclaimed dictator when wrangling the actors, props, and scenery required of the complex scenes in her films and photos, because narrative and communication are extremely important to her invented histories. Whether she's playing her most famous persona, Eleanor Antin, the ballerina, or she's behind the camera recasting the destruction of Troy in the Southern California desert, Eleanor is living her passion for history. Instead of being the invisible, time-traveling witness she imagined as a child, she's a strong creator communicating stories of gender, class, excess, and identity, using history to illuminate and contextualize our present. Her shows are so numerous, I could go on for hours, but I'll just say she has been included in one-woman exhibitions at MoMA, the Whitney, and a major 30-year retrospective at the LA County Museum of Art, which traveled to St. Louis and then to the UK. She was also part of the Venice Biennale, the Sydney Biennale, Documenta 12, among many, many others. Her plays and films have been received worldwide, and she's received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Women's Caucus from the CAA in 2006. She's Emeritus Professor of Visual Arts at the University of California, San Diego, and is represented by Ronald Feldman. Emily Liebert is Curatorial Assistant at the Museum of Modern Art and the Department of Painting and Sculpture. She recently completed a Ph.D. at Columbia, and her dissertation, Roles Recast, Eleanor Antin in the 1970s, is the first monographic study of the artist. It has received support from the Henry Luce Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Smithsonian. Emily is also the curator of a related exhibition, and there are pamphlets on the table there, of multiple occupancy Eleanor Antin Selves, which is currently on view at Columbia's Wallach Art Gallery before traveling to the ICA in Boston. The exhibition is accompanied by a catalog that she edited. Previously, Emily worked at the Giannini Foundation in Marfa and was a teaching fellow at the Whitney while she was in the Whitney ISP. So everyone, join me in welcoming Eleanor and Emily.
Great, well thank you everybody for coming. It's always fun to get to talk with Eleanor about her work. We've been doing that for a couple of years now. So I'm going to start just by taking you through a very quick run through of some highlights from Eleanor's career, which is now almost 5 decades, has now almost been, she's been making art for almost 5 decades. So this is, of course, just a highlight reel.
Almost half a century.
Almost half a century, that's true. Yeah, that does sound good. And so I'm just going to kind of acquaint you with the images. Not too much interpretation here. Eleanor may jump in if she has a particularly good story. She has great stories for everything she's made. But and then we'll have a conversation, and you can ask questions if there are specific things you want to return to. So this is Blood of a Poet box from 1965 to 68, and I think Eleanor has described this as her sort of first quote-unquote mature work. It consists, as you can see, of a box with 100 blood samples that she took from various artists who were part of her social circle. It was collected, the reason it has 65 to 68, these blood samples were collected over a 3-year period, and Eleanor defines artist in a broad way, so it includes, poet in a broad way. So it includes, actual poets who write poetry, as well as artists and dancers, and on the right side is a list of the names that go along with the blood samples. So it actually, I think, is a sort of a fun diary of the period, in addition to being a really interesting artwork. One of the things that I love about this piece is that you can't see it, the resolution isn't great in this image, but when you look at the work, you have this array of blood samples, and they almost look like this kind of funny assemblage of sort of painterly marks. They look like almost sort of abstract marks, and I know Eleanor made this when she said that she was kind of leaving behind her beginnings as a 6th generation abstract expressionist. This is movie boxes from 1969, and here these are images that are supposedly fragments from a longer narrative, so kind of playing with the idea that a full movie is just, is a series of moments or, or images that we sort of string together with our thinking. And this actually, I think you think of this as two movies, right? It's one movie at the top and another movie below. They were set up in these, in the kinds of vitrines that show movie posters. So they were sort of presented as movies themselves. Oh, and I'll just say here, from an early point, I think two things that kind of declare themselves in this work that would be important throughout Eleanor's career are this interest in the fragment and the way that fragments can be rearranged and used to kind of disrupt typical narrative sequence, and also a really early interest in film, which we'll come back to. Portraits of 8 New York women from 1970. Again, an interest in the fragment. These are portraits of object-based portraits, I think consumer sculptures, you sometimes call them, based on 8 women who, some of whom Eleanor knew, some of whom she didn't. It's Margaret Mead, Yvonne Rainer, Carolee Schneemann, Naomi Dash, and
I think I knew them all.
you knew them, Margaret Mead?
Yeah, I met her.
Oh, really? Oh, cool, okay. So they were, I guess, objects that you assembled sort of based on their personalities or sort of equivalents in a sense for who they were. And this, I love that, this is my favorite picture of this piece because Eleanor had been showing with this very interesting gallery, Game Ground Gallery, in the late 1960s, and they suddenly closed. She didn't have a venue for this project, so she rented a room for a month in the Chelsea Hotel, and you can see her. I think you did get someone to staff the gallery, but you see Eleanor in the background there, I think looking a little weary by the whole process. But I think
Well, I moved out their furniture and put in mine.
okay. That would be a great hotel room to come into. But one of the things that I love, I mean, I would have loved to see this. It was later recreated at Ron Feldman's. I would have loved to see it in this installation. But one of the things that I think is interesting also about this piece is, and this is something that I think you've done throughout your career, is taking this limitation and kind of using it to make a really interesting artistic decision. And I think we see that in the, yes, this is true too, in the next work, 100 Boots. These are 200 boots. Probably many of you have seen this before. It's a series of 51 postcards mailed between 1971 and 1973. This is the first postcard, 100 boots facing the sea. The boots start on the beach in San Diego, and they end up at the Museum of Modern Art. I like this picture showing them crossing the street in Midtown. Actually, you can't see, but on the corner on the left is a shoe store. I don't know if you had that in mind. But over the course of the 51 postcards, this sort of postcard novel, it's actually modeled on the form of the picaresque, which is a long-form narrative that follows the exploits of a different hero. So Don Quixote is an example of that. So these 51 postcards follow the adventures of these 50 pairs of boots as they get into trouble, relax, trespass, go to war at one point, and of course they're very much marked by Eleanor's wit and humor as always. And then this too, I think, is interesting in relation to this, this kind of working with a limitation and using it to make a really interesting artistic decision. I think this followed from the kind of exhausting ordeal of setting up portraits of 8 New York women in Chelsea Hotel on your own without a gallery, and you talk about in the New York winter, and you talk about going back on the plane to San Diego. And just feeling like, oh my God, I don't want to have to keep doing this and be beholden to the white box spaces in New York in the dead of winter. So, how can you make an artwork that you could just, distribute from the comfort of your beautiful studio in San Diego? So from that came this really interesting piece that was distributed through the mail to a mailing list of about 1,000 people. Oh, and an important piece of this project is that the spacing of each postcard had a relationship to the narrative. So, for example, there's one image of the booths trespassing. Well, they couldn't, stay in the trespass space for a long time, so pretty soon after that postcard, another postcard followed.
3 days.
3 days, okay. So, so there was a relationship between the narrative that the postcards depicted and the way they entered the recipients' lives. And the recipients talk about, there's a wonderful archive related to this piece that's held at LACMA in Los Angeles of all of the mail that Eleanor received during the piece. And it's this great sort of portrait of her audience at the time and various objects that you got and letters and things like that. And then one of the things, so there's really this kind of sense of these active recipients. And one of the things that a lot of the recipients have talked about is the kind of surprise that they sort of got sucked into this narrative in part by kind of going to the mail every day and not knowing when a booth would pop up in their mail.
So that there were the same recipients for each of these?
Yes, unless they asked to be taken off the list or added, right?
Could you just repeat the question?
Yeah, were the same recipients for each of your mailings?
Oh, over 3 years, people get divorced, people split, they die. They write me letters occasionally saying, you're haunting my fucking mailbox. It also was getting to be actually rather well known around. The newspapers used to like putting in, like, remember the Washington Post had one of the images on, say, page 2, and then it said go to page 5, and there'd be another, go to page 10, and there'd be another. And then there always was, in those cases, when it would go to regional places, there would be people who would say, could Antin please put me on her mailing list? And I certainly would. So I put them on. Meanwhile, I'd take off, it was first class mail, which by the way was 6 cents. And then in the middle of it became 8 cents, which I was very indignant about. But it's a piece that you probably could not do. Well, now one wouldn't. I mean, you have the internet, it's a different situation. But I also did it all. I started off with a set of Mimeo sheets, if any of you remember what that was. And as I said, there's no computers. And then as people would be I would tear them off and have to write the new people with, pen and ink. I never trusted anybody to really mail it out to every single person because the list was getting really long. Once I had the flu, and my friend, who's actually not living anymore, Kathy Acker, the poet.
Oh, yeah.
So Kathy, I trusted. She was as compulsive as me. So she and her boyfriend at the time, who was Gordon, I forgot his last name, and I should remember because he used to model for some of my classes. But Peter Gordon, and they mailed out the section called War. There was a war in which the booths went up and up a hill and took over a burned building. And there were 5, and they had to be mailed every 3 days. And they did it. Most of it was, I say, by hand. So otherwise, I had to do it all, except when it was at MoMA. And then at MoMA, for the New York Adventure, we took 20 new pictures and whatever. And I chose 5 images, and every week they would send to my mailing list. They print up a card and they send it out, which was really cool because they did all the work. But I must say they had the lousiest printing job. They ended up at MoMA, not only literally the final picture is them going, or that's not the final picture, not only do they go into MoMA, but the very end of this project was an installation of the postcards at MoMA, as well as the booths themselves in a sort of Lower East Side tenement. Well, sort of
installation.
Odd crash pad. It's a curious story how that all developed. Out of the uptightness of MoMA and its hierarchical mania, and also it worked out well for me. I did a better installation than I would have if they had not nudged me to death.
This is Domestic Peace from 1971 to 72, and this is just, these are 2 out of 15 pages. When Eleanor and her husband David and son Blaze were staying with Eleanor's mother in her mother's small New York apartment for 17 days around the holidays.
I had a show, so I...
Oh, your show?
Yeah,
That was
so,
the occasion?
Yeah, so she babysat.
So
And
there were
was
good
free of
reasons to
charge,
do
yes.
it. Yeah, there were good reasons to do it, but maybe some family tensions too.
Yes.
So to potentially alleviate those, I think you came to New York armed with a repertoire of what you called conversation openers, various topics, some more provocative than others, and each day Eleanor would begin the day with one of these openers, a conversation opener for her and her mother to discuss. And then she, and you can see the openers are printed at the bottom, and then she documented what followed from that opener. So there's one line, it's hard to read, the top line says me, the bottom line says mother, and the sort of the lines that you see, the kind of patterns have a key that's part of this piece, and they indicate different moods that followed from the conversation opener. So one of the things that that is, I think, sort of key to Eleanor's thinking around conceptualism is sort of poking fun, as she calls them, of the boys. So kind of taking these very sort of dry aesthetics of conceptual artists, her peers, male conceptual artists of the time, what's sometimes called an aesthetic of administration, and importing this really funny material, these sort of containing this completely uncontainable material, the dynamics between a Jewish mother and her daughter. This is another of one of Eleanor's best-known pieces, carving a traditional sculpture over a period of 38 days. Eleanor went on a diet, and each day is represented by a vertical row, and it shows her from the front, back, left, and right, naked. And starts, so day 1 is on the left, day 38 is on the right, and it shows her, you do actually really see she lost, I think, 11 pounds over that 38-day period, and you do really sort of see her body kind of diminishing over that time. Another sort of joke with the boys, the conceptual art boys, but also really, I mean, this piece is just this incredible sort of take or rethinking of so many different art historical moments, from Muybridge to Muybridge, early film, conceptual art, a conceptual artist, like not only in the form of conceptual art, but this is sort of playing with the idea of someone like Solowit, who's typically considered one of the quote unquote fathers of conceptual art, who developed a practice of taking a premise and then kind of letting a work unfold based on this very basic premise. So Solowit's starting point was what happens if you take a cube and remove one side, you remove all of its sides, how many different variations do you get? And here Eleanor's sort of playing that, saying if you take the body of a 37-year-old woman and put it on a diet for this number of days, what are the variations you get? So sort of importing personal and narrative components into that. There's also really interesting, unfortunately, you can't see it here, but each photograph, she's always standing against a door, and I think that's a really important component of this piece. One of the things that this front, back, left, right is also playing with is, of course, criminal photography, the mug shot, anthropometry. But the door, I think, adds this really interesting narrative dimension. Is she about to leave? It sort of encloses the viewer in the room with her. Anything you want to add about this piece?
Door.
The closed door, yes. So now we get into her Selves. This is Eleanor as the king of Solana Beach. This was her first self. She thought she was going to, feel funny talking about you in the third person. But I know you'll correct me. I know you'll correct me if I'm wrong. So as her first self, she thought, okay, you know, who would I be if I was a man? She chose the most, you know, sort of regal, iconic male form she could think of, a king, but of course this king is not such a regal king. He is in a wonderful video that's called The King. We see Eleanor over a period of about an hour dressing up as the king, applying a beard to her face. I guess that's the main thing, as you've said. You had two ways of transforming yourself into a man. One was significantly easier than the other. So applying the beard to your face, and then when she was done, she thought she really looked like Anthony Van Dyck's representation of Charles I, the 17th century English king who was a bit of a loser. And in Eleanor's words, and so she felt a sort of affinity to him, and then he lost his head. That's right. Right. I won't get the quote exactly right. I won't try to quote it, but there's I think a really fascinating quote that we focus on in the show from the exhibition panels where Eleanor compares the king to her. Say he was a loser like me, no one I ever voted for got elected, we couldn't stop the war in Vietnam. So there's this real sense of even though you're choosing this king from 17th century England, there's a real sense of you choose this sort of helpless figure from history to reflect on a kind of political helplessness that you describe at that moment. So here we see Eleanor's king having beer with some of the local surfers in San Diego. One of the king's projects was Eleanor would just in her king getup would just wander around the streets of Solana Beach, San Diego, greeting her subjects. And her friend Belle Steinmetz would sort of covertly keep a camera and take photographs of particularly interesting encounters. And one of the things that I think is true of the king and your various selves is that you're certainly not attempting to pass as a man. It's Eleanor Antin, yes, big breasts, low cut shirt, long hair. It's certainly, you know, Eleanor Antin dressed up. Oh, okay. But it's certainly Eleanor Antin dressed as a king, and it will the next few slides will show Eleanor's different selves, the personae that she invented between 1972 and 1991, and I think in each of these, the space between Eleanor Antin and herself, and the self that she's dressing up as, is a key piece of the project.
May I ask, was Adrian Piper also working in this way at that time? I mean, were you familiar with what she was doing?
I knew Adrian, sure.
Right.
She had this mustache that she
right.
painted on,
Mm-hmm.
and then but she was playing with other things at that point in relation to race. And,
right. Did you guys ever meet in drag?
Not in drag, but socially.
Well, two credit, East Coast and West Coast also.
Yeah.
The next self was a ballerina, and this ballerina also had a sort of a doomed fate like the king. She had taught herself, she's, as you say, from the sticks. She had taught herself how to dance using a book and a mirror, and she masters the art of the pose, as we see in the photograph above, but she can't dance in motion. But she dreams of moving to New York and joining George Balanchine's ballet, and her idea is that while all of the other company members are dancing in motion, she'll distinguish herself by just standing still and holding the pose. So this is a wonderful piece called Caught in the Act, and it has a photographic component which shows, it's a whole series of the ballerina holding these poses quite elegantly. And then it's accompanied by a video, and it's a video still you're seeing at the bottom, and the video shows the production of these photographs. So what we learn in the video is that to strike a pose, the ballerina has to hold on to a stick. You see a character who's named in the credits, Help, offering her a stick. She grabs a stick, gets her pose, and when she's ready, she shouts to the photographer to take a picture. Now, right. He takes a picture. Yeah, so it's funny, the soundtrack to this video is this kind of tinny piano music, and then the ballerina just shouting, now, every once in a while. And then, so this photograph is snapped, and then she collapses. So we see kind of outside the fraction of a second of the photograph, the ballerina is really quite klutzy. And this is, so it's called the act, the ballerina is revealed in her kind of clumsiness, but it's also, an important piece of this video, of this piece is Eleanor exploring the possibilities of truth-telling and story, and fiction weaving in different mediums, photograph and video.
Well, it's like the two different truths of moving camera and a still camera.
This is a still from a video called The Ballerina and the Bum. The ballerina and the bum travel across country, and this is really where we hear about the ballerina's dreams, moving to New York and joining Ballerina's Ballet. The next self is Little Nurse Eleanor, and this is a continued consideration of the ballerina, of course, after Eleanor creates her king, this kind of iconic representation of male power. She thinks, okay, what's the, iconic feminine figure? The ballerina is one. And then I think you started to think about other feminine stereotypes, and the nurse seemed like a good way to explore these. I think you talked about wanting to find a figure who represented the scapegoat, fantasy, sex object, and something else. Various feminine stereotypes. So you chose the nurse. I think it was between the nurse or the airline stewardess. And Little Nurse Eleanor is manifested as a paper doll, and she appears in two wonderful videos, these sort of elaborate paper doll dramas that Eleanor, dressed in a nurse's uniform, as you can see here, sort of the naughty nurse, dramatizes with these various paper dolls. One is called The Adventures of a Nurse. It kind of tells the romantic misadventures of Little Nurse Eleanor. The other is The Nurse and the Hijackers, and that's a much more kind of elaborate plot where the nurse encounters radical leftist environmentalists who hijack a plane headed to Washington, D.C. and reroute it to a series of OPEC nations to try to convince the leaders of the nations to stop exporting oil to the U.S. In the hope that the U.S. will find new alternative energy solutions. So it's actually, I just have to give that kind of long-winded summary of the plot, because it is so ahead of its time to be thinking about these, environmental issues in 1976, 77. But it's really the pleasure of these, part of the pleasure of these videos really is watching Eleanor take these casts of paper dolls through these elaborate scenes. And I think an important piece is, as Eleanor said, my scenes were those available to little girls everywhere, narratives of paper dolls. And an important piece of the video, I think, really is Eleanor moving the paper dolls and really engaging in the narrative and the imagination. Okay, and the reason I was going through this is that we're supposed to get through this more quickly if I did it, but it's how can we not stop on this work? We're getting there. After Little Nurse Eleanor was Nurse Eleanor Nightingale, the Grand Nurse, and this is a nurse that's based on Florence Nightingale, who of course left her her Victorian upper class upbringing in England to serve as a nurse in the Crimean War, and her story is represented through a series of photographs that this is from that show her life at home, and then her life at work. And these are these wonderful scenes that were staged by Eleanor and acted. The actors were her friends in San Diego, all dressed appropriately, dressed in period costumes. And when these photographs were first shown, they were set to the backdrop. They were the backdrop for a play called The Angel of Mercy that again told Nurse Eleanor Nightingale's story about leaving home to go to the Crimean War. And Eleanor played the part of Nightingale in this play alongside a cast of 20 Masonite, nearly life-size, 40 nearly life-size Masonite puppets. So kind of get sort of the next stage up from the paper dolls, and she moves them around. She plays her part and gives them all their voices, sort of the ventriloquist for all these Masonite puppets, and they're set on wheels, and she moves them around on stage, and it's a wonderful, hilarious, but quite moving kind of meditation on moral responsibility in war and the relationship between the domestic and the home front. And maybe we can talk a little, we have a conversation about your choosing the Crimean War. I think one reason was that it was sort of unprecedented in its representation for its time. That it was the first one that was really documented in pictures. Eleanor Antinova is the next self. This is the more fleshed out ballerina. Her story is she is an African-American ballerina of Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, and she, like all of the selves, has sort of doomed aspirations. She wants to play the classic roles of Giselle, Sylphide, eventually Marie Antoinette, but Diaghilev loves her because she can play, because he wants to keep her cast in the more exotic roles, Pocahontas, the slave, Cleopatra, things like that. So that sort of marks her story, this ambition and the way she's kind of held in these particular roles based on her race and the color of her skin. But all of the selves are misfits in various ways, and Antinova is the sort of classic misfit, or is the misfit most of all. I'd say she's modernist in a world that's still hanging on to classicism. She's aging in an industry that celebrates youth, and she's black when most of ballet's star parts are written for white bodies. This is Before the Revolution. It's a play that Eleanor wrote and first performed in 1979 at the Kitchen in New York and the Santa Barbara Museum of Contemporary Art. This play, sort of in very basic terms, tells the story of Eleanor Antinova wanting to play Marie Antoinette and Diaghilev saying no, and the sort of conflict that ensues from that, and finally she does play Marie Antoinette, and we see what happens then. So originally when Eleanor performed this, she played the part of Eleanor Antinova, again alongside a cast of 6 Masonite puppets plus a lamb, which she moved around on stage and gave voices to, as with Angel of Mercy. This was then re-performed in 2012 on the occasion of the Getty Museum's Pacific Standard Time, and on the occasion of the re-performance, an African-American, when Eleanor first played Eleanor Antinova, she slightly darkened her skin with foundation for African-American actors. And in the newer performance, I think the thinking was if it wasn't Eleanor playing the part of Antinova, it would be better in 2012 for it to actually be an African-American actress. So that was one shift. That was one change. Another change was that each of the Masonite puppets had a human counterpart. So it ended up being a cast of, I guess, about 11 animate and inanimate actors. And then the final incarnation of this project is a recent film called Fragments of a Revolution that sort of is an imaginative retelling of the creation of this more recent incarnation of the play. Who Cares About a Ballerina? This is another play that Eleanor wrote and starred in as Eleanor Antinova. From the Archives of Modern Art is a film which is up right now, both in the show at Columbia and at MoMA, in their contemporary art installation. And this is one of my favorite Antinova pieces. It focuses on Antinova's later career as her story goes. After Diaghilev dies, there was no place for her in the Ballet Russe. So to make ends meet, she starred on sort of tacky vaudeville stages and in popular silent films in America. This film, the documentation of this stage in Antinova's career was presumed to be lost. I'm still telling the story as it goes, until an enterprising archivist in LA found this footage and pieced it together in this kind of fragmentary imaginary documentary from the archives of modern art. Loves of a Ballerina also focuses on the later career of Antonova. It's this installation stage set, as you can see. You can look through the portals and see some of the film footage that's featured in from the archives of modern art. And there's also sort of an installation that has a ghostly image of Antonova projected onto her dressing room mirror. The final self is Yevgeny Antonov, a Russian film director, and this is a still from The Last Night of Rasputin. Yevgeny, by the way, was also supposedly Antonova's lover. The Last Night of Rasputin is a silent film that Antonov supposedly made in 1924, and it kind of dramatizes political intrigue, decadence, and the end of Rasputin. This is the last appearance of Eleanor Antinova in 1989. The Man Without a World, this continues Yevgeny Antonov's story. This is, again, supposedly a film made in his hand. After he gets into trouble with Stalin for his politics, he flees to Krakow, Poland, and there he encounters some American entrepreneurs who commission him to make a film on Polish shtetl life, which they'll distribute in the Jewish American, distribute for the Jewish American nostalgia market. And so The Man Without a World is the film that he supposedly makes for this commission. So, and one of the things that I really appreciate about the Selves project is just how committed you are to the artistic vision of the Selves. I think of it as it's sort of like a Russian doll artist, an artist inside an artist.
He disappointed his backers because it was basically a political film in which you saw the, the shtetl world was, a little small town world. There were young people in it who wanted to enter the real world, the modernist world that was out there, and there's the heroes are a communist, a socialist, a Zionist, whatever party you could think of, and a surrealist poet. And they have all sorts of, believe it or not, in the silent film, they have all sorts of arguments and discussions and terrible disagreements, and then it's a melodrama and ends with death. And finally, they go off. The poet goes off with the ballerina. There is Antonova. I also, besides directing it and writing it, acted in it as a bad gypsy girl, and I take off the poet. I take him away from the shtetl out into the modernist world, which is, as my mother would say, Bolsheva, which is Warsaw.
How long is the piece?
That's a feature, and it's distributed. It's still distributed a number of places. It's kind of a minor film, a minor cult classic. I say minor. I think it would be minor. But I think it's a major film.
Okay, I'm going to just really speed through these last pieces. Vilna Nights, installation of the Jewish Museum that shows a bombed out ghetto from Vilna with some projections that show the sort of that give a sort of afterlife, give a sort of presence to Vilna when it was flourishing. Minetta Lane, an installation that resembles 1950s Greenwich Village, and there's a soundtrack that kind of summons street life and various projections that show the inhabitants of this set of the apartments. Okay, and then the most recent, well actually it's not the most recent, but a recent body of work, Constructing Helen from Helen's Odyssey, and The Judgment of Paris, also from Helen's Odyssey, and this is Eleanor did several series of photographs that were these kind of elaborate tableaux that based on ancient Greek and Roman themes, but also ancient Greek and Roman history themes, and also their representations in history paintings. And then the most recent project, well, I mentioned Fragments of a Revolution, but also what we couldn't represent really in images is a wonderful memoir that Eleanor wrote called Conversations with Stalin that was recently published by the Integer Press. So I think that sort of brings us up to the present. So one thing that I think just really jumps out as we look through all of this work is, of course, your interest in history. And I almost think of history as one of your mediums. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you've chosen some of the moments in history that you've focused on, and what your process is to really sort of research and inhabit them.
Okay, well, easiest would be to start here.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's the most recent, and that's when I realized that the American empire of today is quite similar in many ways to the Roman Empire of yesterday, and that started with my recognition of some of the affluent beach communities of San Diego and LA, the similarity to Pompeii, sort of living the good life, as it were, on the brink of annihilation. And the first show of these was actually the last days of Pompeii. And I deliberately did them in a 19th century salon painting style. They're very large photographs, these, really big. And they're done in the style of the empires of the 19th century, which would be, the Brits, the French, when those are the kind of paintings they would have, as they're inventing a sort of powerful Rome is also very sexy and kind of titillating for them. And so I did it within their painterly language, only I transformed it into these. Don't show it quite that much because this one, but this one's funny. I do like that. It's based on Rubens' Judgment of Paris, and you see these two guys. One is Hermes and one is Paris, looking a little bit like California surfers. And I had two Helens, a dark Helen and a light Helen. Dark Helen is sitting on a trunk I use in a lot of works, with an old trunk, theater trunk with all sorts of labels from different hotels around the world. And she's sitting there waiting to begin her life, and she won't know what her life is until the man has made the choice. Of course, that the three goddesses whom he's supposed to choose, this famous Smith, would be Hera, or the wife, or Juno, the wife of Jupiter, or Zeus, however. And I have her as a 30s housewife, or 50s housewife. I love the vacuum cleaner in the leaves. And then Aphrodite would be the middle one. There's little Eros with her, and she's like a 40s movie star. And there is Athena, who is always has, is warlike, but is also the goddess of the mind. And I have her sort of like, you might say like Patty Hearst. And the back, it's very curious when you think of this, okay? These are huge. And we are, in the cases where I reconstructed an old painting, we had to repaint them, and we always see them as little squares in books anyway, or a slide, or if we're lucky we see them on the wall in an idiotic looking gold frame, right? So what here we had to do in order to make them fit human beings, not painted beings, was everything had to be made very large and in a different set of measurements. So it was very curious how this, to work this to fit humans within it. And this is the whole painted backdrop, you can't see it well in the slides, but from the Rubens judgment, there's a lot of judgments in Paris. This one was Rubens. I chose that one deliberately, I don't remember why exactly. And okay, well that's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so part of it.
Or you want me to talk about history in general?
Well, I mean,
Oh,
you know,
man.
however you want to take my questions, you always take my questions in a good direction.
Well, you know, all right. Now we may know a little bit more about the future than we used to. Now we know that probably the future is complete annihilation for the Earth. Hopefully it will not take a short time. We don't know exactly. We certainly know that enormous changes are taking place and will continue. How we survive, if we survive, I have no idea. But when you think of the way I thought of sci-fi in the early days, it's very odd. It was somehow like the streets were always kind of clean and like nobody ever did the laundry. It was very unreal. But when you thought of the past, you had smells and lives and murders and romances and problems of all sorts, and things that I could recognize. And I've always been a political person, so I could recognize all of these things. And in the future, who the hell knew what that was going to be? I said now, unfortunately, we do know, but then we didn't know. So, you know, my fascination, like the first book, my great book was, that I loved so much that I must have read about 10 times, was Robin Hood. And though I've never taken up the Middle Ages to work with, probably because I'm so disinterested in religion, especially the church. Probably that reason, but who knows? The past has always seemed to me a marvelous theater with which one can play. I also was brought up actually with a lot of high culture. My mother used to be an actress on the Yiddish stage in Poland, and she was also a Stalinist. And so I was brought up with this Russian culture and high culture, and of course I like pop culture on my own, but so playing with all of these older times,
Yeah.
very natural.
Yeah. Could I ask you a question about your book, A Conversation with Stalin? I heard you do a reading at Ron Feldman's gallery. I also understand that inside of the book you talk about your mother having had an affair with Stalin. Is that?
Oh,
Is this
wouldn't my
fiction?
mother have liked that? No, that was, what I said is that Stalin was my friend, my secret friend when I was growing up. And I would meet him in Central Park every afternoon, and I would go over my problems, you know, all sorts of problems, depending, you know, on the age, what's happening, and, you know, romantic problems, economic problems, whatever. And he would tell me what to do, and everything, and would fuck everything up even worse. So, but I said I never told my mother, because my mother was an extremely glamorous and charming woman, and I figured she'd take him as her friend and wouldn't be mine anymore. So.
I actually have a question about conversations with Stalin. You stop, it tells, in it, you think through your life from being a very little girl up until you enter the art world. So it has this kind of interesting stopping point. So I'm interested after, as you say, after half a century of a very successful and lively career in the art world, why at this moment when you look, you know, why stop your memoir before you enter the art world?
Well, for one thing, by the end of the book, Stalin dies in 1953, and by then I was totally disillusioned. Unlike my mother and stepfather, But I was totally disillusioned, and he would no longer be a character in the book. And it is the structure around which the book, all the other adventures, even though it just moves in and out of basically my experiences. And I thought that I would continue and do another book, and I started as a writing major. In college, I was a writing major. And it was only because the art world opened up, and you could do video and film and photography and of course drawings and my king paintings, because I love to draw and do those things too. You could do them all together as everything was opening up in the conceptual art world, and that's what drew me right from the otherwise I think I would have been a writer. I thought that I would do a book after this one called The Rest of My Life, which of course was most of my life. And what happened was I realized, you know, I've been traveling. I go around, I travel, people are always asking me questions. I'm going around, like all around the world, talking about, people ask me about things, and I start to talk about works, and they all turn out to be like funny stories. But you know, when you live through them, they weren't so funny. You know, a lot of dark stories, and I thought, well, this is my chance to get revenge on a lot of people. And I thought, well, that might be fun to do the rest of my life. And I was going to do it, and then a friend of mine, a critic named Lisa Bloom, I was having lunch with Lisa, and Lisa, I was telling her, you know, and then I'm going to talk about this, and then I'm going to say what happened here, and then I'm going to say, and she said, why do you want to think about all these miserable things? And being an artist has been incredible and has made my life incredibly interesting and has clarified so much of reality for me and helped me to maintain inventing reality, which is what reality is. It's part invention and part what you happen to find, you know, what you happen to stumble over in the street. But I realized, no, I don't think I really want to do that. My work is there for those almost 50 years. And I think it tells the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, again, trying to stay with some of your recent works, but this is an interesting project before the revolution because you've really sort of given it 3 lives. You know, it was written as a play in 1979. You performed it in 1970. Well, you performed it in 1979. Then in 2012, you were the director when it was performed again. And I think you and Alex Agade and Malik Gaines, the producers of this play, are clear that it's not a re-performance, it's a new version of the play.
Well, you have other actors.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction. So it had a second life in 2012, and then it had sort of a third life in this film that was completed just a few months ago, which I mentioned, Fragments of a Revolution, which is, you call it a provocational spectacle that comes from, it incorporates footage from the rehearsals and the performance of the 2012 production, and it has these wonderful sort of tangents into footage from the world of Louis XIV that Antonova wants to enter. So, you know, not...
Yeah, I should explain your life. You can see here, the larger puppets are like the smaller paper dolls. They can change who they are by costume. So if you see Louis with the gold clothespins and his king suit, well, when you take the king suit off, he's Diaghilev. And he's, I painted all these myself. So he's in a tuxedo and he looks with his big black hat like Diaghilev, and then he becomes her husband. And that's Danielle Watts, who is a young actress who plays Eleanor, and she did a very charming job. And so that actually, while you said there were 11 characters in this one, there are, but there really are 5 actors.
Right, and but so what was it, I don't know, what was it like sort of going through this project as an actor and stage director and a film director?
Well, I've always been a director because I was always directing myself.
That's
and my
true.
puppets. And I happen to like directing. And I wrote them.
Yeah.
So, you know, I had a special feeling towards these pieces. And then I performed in that. So, I think it's really rather exhausting. So, this one, it was great fun to be able to direct the actors. I must say that in the 90s, I wrote about 5 or 6 real plays. I mean, sort of avant-garde plays, but plays in relation to Antinova. One of them I would like to do again with one character. One I think I would like to direct again in a, you know, in a sort of small box theater. But and I was doing them in theatrical situations. I seem to have spent my life trying to get out of the art world. And I guess, like most artists, it's never enough. No matter what good things happen to you, as I say, it's never enough. You've spent your whole life, I was also a professor at UCSD for 30 years, I had students and all, but basically I was an artist. The other fed my art career, you know. So basically, you spend your life working, and what can, afterwards it's over, it's a play or a book or a set of drawings, or, but it's, and the years go by, and you spent it the best way and the way you wanted to spend it, but there's really not much time for anything else. And then I realized, well, you know, I had the same husband for 50 years. And I had a son who now has 2 kids of his own. So I did manage other things as well. But basically my life essentially was as an artist. And for when you give your life to something so passionately, then in some sense you are never rewarded. You're rewarded because of the pleasures of doing the work, but then afterwards it's gone. It's out of your hands. Either somebody, like the pleasures I had doing the Blood of a Poet box, going off different readings, getting everyone's blood, you know, like people, funny experiences. Frank O'Hara saying, sperm yes, blood no. You know, I mean, all this kind of thing. John Ashbery saying, oh shit, no, I can't allow any of my blood out there. I'm superstitious and terrible things will happen to me. And, you know, like, or Tuli Kupferberg, one of the thugs, saying, why are you using, they were sewing needles, why are you using a different needle for me than you used for, say, Ed Sanders just before? And I say, well, you know, there's germs, so now I'm using another one, and I'm washing you off with some, you know, peroxide. And he said, why? Germs have to live. So I said, well, you want to help them? He said, absolutely. He took one of the dirty needles and he said, here. You know, I mean, all these wonderful things happen. So where now? I don't have it anymore, but I wouldn't look at it if I had it anymore either. And I love that work, and it took about 2.5 years of my life. It's at the Tate now. They own it. They can put it up when they do, and on a sculpture stand or whatever. And that's fine, but it's, you know, and I love that piece, but it's not mine anymore. You know, it's over.
Maybe we should see if other people have questions.
Yes, I see that we had a couple of people actually running up to work and stuff, too.
I knew that was the reason you met so early.
But I wanted to say, Eleanor, it's an amazing body of work, and certainly hereafter we shall revel in it continually. I think it's got a life above and beyond the sacrifices that an artist puts in. And certainly, as arts ministers, we, of course, are at your beck and service. Try to continue to make that part of an ongoing dialogue for generations to come.
Oh, I just realized we should make a plug for your reading this weekend.
Oh, yeah. But I can't say where it is because I don't know.
Okay, I remember. I can't say the location, but I mean the street address, but it's at Zinc Bar, and I'm extremely excited. It's a wonderful opportunity to see Eleanor read and her husband David do sort of a spoken piece. So it's
Yeah,
Zinc
he's a
Bar,
talk
4:30
poet,
to
so
6:30.
What day?
Saturday, this Saturday.
I think it's about 4:30, yeah.
Yeah, 4:30 to 6:30. It's a segue poetry series.
So on that note, I'm just going to ask Jennifer if there are any ArtTable oriented things. Thank you so much. It was so wonderful.
We have a couple of coming programs. We have a tour of the Queen's Museum with Tom Finkelpearl, which is sold out, but if you would like to be placed on the waiting list, you can get in touch with me. The 25th, we have one of our members, Emily Wallach, who just completed a film on Ilya and Amelia Kabakov, and we're doing a screening and a
Oh, and it's
conversation.
reviewed in the New York Times today.
In fact, today it opens at Film Forum.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that'll be a good chance to get to speak with her about the making of that film. The 26th, we have a meet at Morgan Lehman Gallery. And then we have our holiday party at DC Moore on the 19th of December. Am I missing something?
You're missing the 19th.
The No Longer Empty workshop.
Yeah,
we have
So we have a workshop, which No Longer Empty. It's a curatorial workshop looking at different practices of urban revitalization and No Longer Empty specific model of site-specific curation. And that's a hands-on workshop with their president and head curator, so that should be fun.
And
Couple
Miami,
of
that's
other,
all too.
couple of other things.
Oh,
Lots going on. And then we have Miami Basel, which unfortunately our other staff member handles, so I don't know all of the details, but we have passes and a full day of studio tours with one of our board members that is down in Miami, and visiting the opening, the Perez Museum, the Ai Weiwei show that's going on there. Very full calendar of events.
yeah, that's on December 4th, actually.
Wonderful.
Lots going on.
Thank you, Lucy. Also, we are not going to have a December program for the breakfast, but we'll resume in January, and we are looking at Wengechi Mutu as well as Kirame Weems. So there's some good programming coming up in our.
No, we
in
never
our-
repeat.
Sorry?
No, there's a question. No.
And also, I want to just give a shout out to S.N. Nichols from Perform on 13, who provided us with some of the information and led us to Eleanor, which was one of their suggestions. Of course, Perform on 13 is happening around the city, really wonderful programming everywhere. And Eleanor's current show, would you like to speak to that a little bit? It's still on until...
Yeah, multiple occupancy, Eleanor Antin Selves, which focuses on Selves that I spoke about, is up at Columbia's Wallach Gallery until December 7th. So there is wonderful work there to see.
And I just have to say that I happened to see Eleanor's show in the morning and then go to see the Mutu show at Brooklyn in the afternoon. And boy, is there a perfect art historical thread there. So it's actually fantastic that you will have her in January because you can kind of see the fruit of what Eleanor and her peers.
Well, we're working on it. We don't have any confirmations, just to be on the safe side, but we're working on it, yeah.
And be sure to check out the Moriko Mori interview that we're posting on our Insights page on ArtNet today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.